This lesson will focus on Chapter 1 and will continue with the previous lesson and lead into talking about political ideology. Ideology is typically placed on a spectrum from left to right. So when you talk about an individual being liberal, you often refer to them as leaning left, and someone that is more conservative as leaning right. Let us talk first about liberalism. So, individuals that consider themselves to be liberal carry an ideology that advocates change in the social, political, and economic realms to better protect the well being of individuals and to produce equality within society. Now, our concept of liberalism is very different than it was historically, or at least our concept of modern liberalism is very different than classical liberalism. And the shift happens during FDR's presidency when the New Deal is implemented and many social programs looking out for the collective well being of society are carried forth. So prior to FDR, liberalism is focused on limited governmental ideas and limited government authority. It also is focused on the government having very little impact on the market economy. Modern liberalism, as we see it today, again, is very connected to FDR. This expectation for a government to be looking out for the general welfare, and that may come with economic investments by the government or carrying out certain types of programs that are looking out for the economic well-being of society. Modern liberals tend to be more supportive of things like Social Security, healthcare that is provided by the government, so universal healthcare programs, as well as safety nets for the poor. Moving on to conservatism, or again, people might refer to themselves as being more conservative, is an ideology that emphasizes the preservation of tradition and reliance on community and family as continuity in society. Conservatives are much more inclined to support a limited government, and so they very much are for this idea of small federal government, especially. And they also believe that the government should have little regulation over the economy, and they tend to also emphasize policies that connect to the economy as well. Typically, their economic policies surround lower taxes, and those taxes especially being lower on businesses. Many would argue that conservatives are not concerned with supporting people who are living below the poverty threshold. But if you ask a true conservative, typically it isn't necessarily so that they don't believe that the poor should be helped or should be provided support. It's more who is responsible for providing that support. So, for example, they are more inclined to believe that charities or churches, basically private organizations, should be in charge of supporting the poor. And that they were much more inclined to do it efficiently, that there would be less corruption, and they just are much more distrustful of a central government doing so. It's also important to note that conservatives are not necessarily anti-government, they're anti-big government. So if government intervention is necessary, which I think it's understandable that it would be in many cases, it should be in the hands of a smaller government, or let's say a local or state government, versus a national federal government. Moving forward, we can take a look at socialism. So with socialism, that is an ideology that advocates economic equity, theoretically achieved by having the government or workers owning the means of production. Typically, individuals that carry a more socialistic ideology are often lumped in with other Democrats. And it is important to note, however, that when we think about socialism or when we talk about socialism, even that concept in it of itself is a spectrum. And there are different ways in which individuals that carry this ideology might describe themselves. So, Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez are often criticized for being socialists, but they self-proclaim themselves to be democratic socialists. Democratic socialists believe that there should be a democratic process that controls not just society, but the economy as well. And they're much more inclined to believe that the economy and society should be working for the benefit of the people as opposed to generating profits. The Bernie Sanders movement has undoubtedly moved the Democratic Party further left. The last political ideology we'll talk about is libertarianism. And that's an ideology whose advocates believe that the government should take a hands off approach in most matters. So, this is very unique in the sense that many libertarians often refer to themselves as economically conservative but socially liberal. That's kind of challenging when you look at it on a spectrum of left and right because libertarians tend to be much more to the right when it comes to economics with other conservatives or traditional conservatives, but they tend to be more so to the left when it comes to social issues. For example, when it comes to the legalization of drugs like marijuana, or when it comes to marriage equality. Libertarians believe in less government and that that is better for both social and economic matters. They support the rights of property owners. They take more of a laissez-faire capitalistic approach, meaning a very hands-off by the government approach, and they are the biggest third party in comparison to Democrats and Republicans. Now, here is the ideological spectrum, plotting a lot of the ideologies that I had just mentioned with a moderate category right in the center. So the more liberal, again, you would be more inclined to lean left, and the more conservative, more inclined to lean right. Again, many would argue that this spectrum is not sufficient to describe the complexity of different ideologies, especially if one were to be more economically conservative but socially liberal, or socially conservative but economically liberal. In this case, a multi-dimensional ideological grid would be better suited. Chapter 1 also places focus on the impact of technology on politics. Technology, especially with the internet and social media, has had a major impact or influence in political participation, especially with younger people. The internet and social media certainly had a major impact in global politics as well. So we saw that social media, especially with social media networks like Facebook, Twitter, that impacted revolutions, particularly in the Middle East, with Tunisia and then Egypt and then eventually Syria, which we still see is at the center of conflict still today. But what the internet or social media proved to be able to do was galvanize people, bring them together, and collectively protest. And eventually, those protests and that collection of people to rise up is what ousted many corrupt leaders. So, taking a look at technology and how that's changed politics, we can look at 18 to 20-year-olds. This is a really young demographic. In the 1970s, we saw 47% of 18 to 20-year-olds participating in the 1976 presidential election. Looking at 2016, during the election between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, we saw that 50% of 18 to 20-year-olds participated. Many would say that technology has a major part to do with that, especially when it comes to internet. Younger people are increasingly relying on the internet for their news. So in the 1970s, where most of the news came from nightly news broadcasts, you have news now coming from outlets, social media. So people are referring to Twitter, internet services, on-demand news networks. And, there's some pros and cons to this. Obviously, there's a variety of a lot of content that might be out there that can truly educate younger people about politics. At the same time, much of it may be very sensationalized, and younger people may also have very biased views on certain topics because they are selectively choosing their media. But nonetheless, we do see that access to more information through a variety of more news outlets has increased voting among younger people. So, around 50% in 2016. That was even higher in this 2020 election, with estimates between 52 to 55%. Now, younger people are increasingly becoming involved in protests that have become very important. So, the Black Lives Matter movement, very focused on immigration rights and voting rights, and they are more active when it comes to internet mainstream as well. American politics went through a tremendous shift post 9/11. So, after these attacks, we saw a soar of patriotism, increased trust in the government, allowing for policies like the Patriot Act to be implemented and take hold that really were true violations of Fourth Amendment rights, really did take away many or at least threaten privacy liberties when it came to citizens. But the citizens were inclined to do that mainly because they felt that it was worth giving up those liberties to be able to receive a sense of security in return. Now, whether this is a false sense of security or a true sense of security, this is what was going on during the time. And so we also see that there was a major increase of blood donations, almsgiving, volunteering during this time. Also, subsequent actions led to a loss of trust and disillusionment in the government for younger voters. So, as people, lived through the experience of these attacks and post 9/11, they also experienced the aftermath of that, decades later. So, realizing that the United States had after these attacks, engaged in a lot of military activity throughout the Middle East. Technically, the United States has been engaged in war for about 20 years now. And many would say that rather than creating more stability and security, it's created less stability or instability and less security. So, just keeping that in mind, we have seen a major shift, especially among millennials. Now, this distrust and disillusionment of the government among young voters is what leads to a lack of efficacy. And efficacy is an important term you should know. It's citizens' beliefs that they have the ability to achieve something desirable through their government, that their government will listen to them. And so we actually see that there is a lack of that among many younger voters. So, younger voters matter. And there are two arguments we can look at here. Undoubtedly, when we're looking at millennials or we're looking at the Gen Z generation, they are the future of politics. They're going to be voting in our politicians. They are going to be dictating and influencing the policies that are given attention. And many that argue that the youth vote will matter are going to refer to the 2008 election, where many millennials came out and influenced the campaigns. We also see this in 2020 with an increase of younger voters voting, especially in favor of Biden. And then, but people who would say, no, you know what, the youth vote isn't going to matter as much. They may say, hey, they're inconsistent, they can't be counted on. We saw this happen in 2016, where many assumed that the youth vote would give that election to Hillary Clinton, but did not turn out in the numbers that were expected. However, when all is said and done, the youth does have the potential for change and are going to have a major impact in future elections. We can also note that many would say younger voters may be more liberal when they are younger, and as they grow older, they become more conservative. But we are seeing that those trends are changing. Millennial voters are actually consistently remaining more liberal than other generations. All right, so we'll wrap things up talking about the last concept here, changing demographics. So, what we do see in the United States is people are moving more and more so into urban areas, particularly younger people, educated people. So, we see that much of the youth is moving out of the Midwest and moving into cities along the coast. And those cities also tend to be much more liberal. It's kind of changing the composition of the country. So as younger people are starting to be more concentrated in certain regions and areas, older people are as well. So we do see a lot of older people moving to places like Florida, where there isn't a state income tax. So it's ideal for retirement. The percentage of white Americans is decreasing while the percentage of minorities is increasing. Single person households are increasing and more women are working, thus putting off marriage and childbearing.